So in the last episode, I was finally able to remove the ducting for good by rerouting the pipes inside the soffit, and then I celebrated that by putting up a casing around the range hood. So moving on from that, I'm going to start by redoing the rim joist installation. And I mentioned before, the air movement. This is how you know. That black stuff is dirt. It's been filtered by the fiberglass from the flowing air, and air movement is not what you want because not only does it affect the insulating performance, it can also cause mold. So as with anything, the first step is to take the measurements, and then I'm going to cut the foam boards 3/4 inch short of those measurements so that when it's centered in the cavity, there will be a 3/8 gap all around. So using a foam rated adhesive, they go up first. Then the gaps get filled with expanding spray foam. This is after 10 minutes. It's going to get a little bit bigger still. I'm going to spray it with some water, but probably going to just come back tomorrow. It's already past 3. Once the excess has been shaved off, the Rockwool can now be cut and placed up against it, and that's it for the rim joist installation. Moving on to the floating shelf mounting holes. This one, I'm attaching another piece and drilling into that instead. The one next to it, I'm actually going to sister this stud because it's kind of cracked all over the place. And I'm doing the same thing on the other side because I don't feel like putting 1/2 inch holes all over the studs. And with the laser up, I'm marking the height of all the mounting holes. Then I take a piece of 2x and plane it down flat, attach it to the wall at the correct height, find the center of the stud, clamp the doweling jig, and drill it out with an extra long 7/16 bit. And now that piece becomes the guide that I can mount at the next height and do the same thing. For this next step, I made myself a tap by cutting some channels along a 1/2 inch threaded rod with the hole drilled on the other end. So, with the screw and a nut combination and a deep socket, I was able to use the ratchet. Once I go in 3.5 inches deep, I would reverse the order of the screw and the nut, and then use the ratchet in reverse to get it out. I did try many times, unsuccessfully, to do this with both the drill and the impact. Every single time though, it would bind up and get stuck somehow. So this was a long, tedious hand crank operation for all 18 holes. On to the drywall now, stripping out everything except the window stool, because for some reason they installed a window on top of it. Also moving that outlet to here. And then proceeded to spray foam all the gaps between the sheathing, the studs, the header, and anywhere else I could feel a draft, which was pretty much everywhere. After that, I installed some strapping on all the edges without framing, including the range backsplash where it's going to share the border with the cement board. I cut the countertop in the middle here so I can remove everything but the sink cabinet. That element needs to stay intact and functional for the time being. The top one is the driver, the carburetor, middle, and the bottom is to the LEDs. So I'm gonna rotate this down so that these two go through the floor to the crawl space, like that, but not until later. And that is lemon. So same on this side. Remove the drywall and then spray foamed all the gaps. And then bring in the Rockwool, or Rockwool as it's called now. So I'm going to start behind the boxes and the pipe first. So the number of seams don't really matter in this case, so you can kind of break them down into however many chunks as you see fit, as long as it ends up filling all the space with no gaps. It's like playing 3D Tetris. You want a nice, tight, gap-free fit and the least amount of compression. The last thing you want to do is squish them into these places, thinking that because it's the same amount of material, that it must be the same R value. The insulating effect comes from the air trapped within the fiber, so if you squish it down, you're reducing the air volume and ultimately the R value with it. Bottom's done. The rest of it's the same thing, just bigger pieces. So it does take a bit longer to cut everything to fit exactly, but I would say that it's not every day you have the wall open, so you may as well put in the effort and make it count. And having said that, it's really not that much more time. Rockwool is so much easier to work with than the fiberglass. It's very easy to handle, it's easy to cut, it holds the shape nicely and doesn't break off and become crazy airborne. As far as performance goes, it's got a bunch of other perks as well. Aside from the R value, it's hydrophobic. So if you had a leak, it's not going to just sit there and soak up all the water and hold it. It's sound suppressing, so good for both exterior and interior walls, especially between floors. And it's also quite fire resistant. So it's good stuff. This stool is nailed down, but it's all under the window, so for now I'm just gonna chop this thing right off. Next to go up is the vapor barrier, the 6mm polyethylene, and I hate working with this stuff. It leaves a ton of plastic residue on your hands, and then that gets on everything you touch and makes everything slippery. After everything's taped, I make a tiny incision to sneak the LED wires through and tape up the opening. Here I'm making a mark on the ceiling to line up with the mounting holes. Then I take measurements from the top down to each mounting hole and make a record of it, and then do the same thing for the next line. This is a 12-footer, and I'm measuring from the left, but cutting from the right, because I want to keep the nice factory edge for the border. Now I can't lift this and hang it right away. I need to guide the LED wires through the holes first, so I'm attaching some resting blocks to help with that. Once I transfer all the measurements and get the holes punched out, I lift the sheet onto the resting blocks, guide the wires through the holes, then finally get the sheet fastened to the wall. For the window opening, I'm making a rough cutout first, then using the actual frame to scribe the edges. To make the final cuts. Few differences for the bottom sheet, starting with marking of the outlets. And of course, no wires to pull, but there are the switches to cut out. With the sink disconnected for the night, did the same thing. Remove everything off the wall, cutting off the bullnose, and closing off any gaps with the spray foam. So this section was actually worked on after the plumbing was redone. You can see down there the drain and the supplies have been swapped out. So chronologically, the next video would have happened before this, but for continuity's sake, I'm re-editing it this way and keeping them separate. For the last sheet, aside from the outlets and switches, there were some additional cutouts as well. That's for the silcock, that's for the drain, the 2 junction boxes, and the furnace intake. I'm going to use a 2.5 inch for this one, and I'm going to go in reverse so it doesn't tear up the paper like crazy. Two and 1/8 for these. And there it is. The old wall is out, and the new wall is in. Next episode is going to be sweating copper joints for the supplies, and then regluing the sweep for the drain pipe. Until then, that's about that.